No, that's fine, right? Okay. Are most people here patients or carers of medical cannabis? Okay. Listen, firstly, we're just going to give you an overview of a theoretical basis of cannabis therapeutics, and then we'll go on to more specific things about different methods of preparation and different conditions and things like that. You must have heard by now about the endocannabinoid system. Now, there's a lot of words and terminology, but none of it's very difficult. So I'll go through it in simple terms because in concept it's a very simple system, although in practice it's exceedingly subtle and complex. So in the talk we're going to cover what is the endocannabinoid system, where it is, what it does, and how we can manipulate it to assist in the restoration of good health. Where's Sista? Okay, as you see there, the endocannabinoid system is described as an evolutionarily conserved group of neuromodulatory lipids and their receptors having a diverse variety of physiological effects. Now, when we say evolutionary conserved, the endocannabinoid system is so important, it appears to be present in all forms of life since the sea squirt about 60 million years ago. So it's been there, and because it's so essential, it's there in all the different forms of life, or forms of animal life anyway. Now, what are cannabinoids? Cannabinoids, by definition, are chemicals that interact with cannabis receptors, and we'll talk about the receptors in a minute. But there's three types of cannabinoids. The endocannabinoids, remember endo just in medicine just means inside. Exo is outside and endo is inside. So endocannabinoids are cannabinoids that are made within the body and act within the body. So the endocannabinoids, there's two major ones, anandamide, which is arachidonyl glycerol, and arachidonyl ethanolamide. They're the body's own cannabis activity. The other ones, the plant or the phytocannabinoids, are the ones that you get from the cannabis plant, and as you'll come to see, they're actually made from terpenes. Terpenes are the smelly parts of nature. Almost anything you smell in nature, whether it's a rose or the herbs or pepper or anything like that, contains volatile compounds called terpenes. And the cannabis plant, and perhaps one or two other plants in creation, have learned to join the two terpenes together, and then that becomes a cannabinoid. So a cannabinoid is a diterpene. But that's a phytocannabinoid or a plant-based cannabinoid. And then there's synthetic cannabinoids, something like Win55, and now there's a whole alphabet of synthetic drugs. Now bear in mind that all these three types are very, very different chemically. They look nothing like each other chemically. The intrinsic or endocannabinoid anandamide is chemically completely distinct from plant-based cannabis, right? The only thing they share in common is their ability to interact with the cannabis receptors. Okay. All right. Endocannabinoid receptors. Now, you've probably heard all about CB1 and CB2. That is a real simplification of the system. At the moment now, there's certainly a third, what they call a G protein coupled receptor. So there's at least three receptors, but it's likely there's going to be many more. It is a very complex system. And what I'll be giving you now is the current state of knowledge, and it's unlikely that this current state will remain constant for the next couple of years, and then we'll be dealing with a much better understanding of the system. So accept that what I say today is provisional and the current state of knowledge, but by no means the final state. Now, in simple terms, it used to be said CB1 receptors were in the brain and CB2 receptors were widely scattered in the immune system and the gut and things like that. It used to be said that THC interacted with CB1 and CBD interacted with CB2 receptors. It's nowhere near that straightforward. It appears there's CB1 and 2 receptors on both sides of the brain, and it certainly appears that the CB2, the cannabidiol of the CBN, interacts in an unusual way with the receptors. Instead of binding directly to the CB1 receptor, for instance, it binds further into the receptor, the molecule itself, but it alters the expression that THC does, and that's how CBD actually changes the effect or modulates the effect of THC. All right, but we'll leave that because it's far too complex a system to present the current state of knowledge. There's a whole lot of question marks about where they are and what they're doing. Okay, but basically there is a whole series of cannabinoid receptors, and we'll go into a bit more detail on the next slide. They're, especially the CB1 receptors, are widely distributed in the brain, and they're heavily distributed in those centres of the brain that have really crucial functions in the control of appetite, in sexual desire, in all sorts of things that interact with our day-to-day lives. They all appear to be modulated by the endocannabinoid system in a way that's yet not very clear. And the big mystery of the endocannabinoid system is actually how it's run, and I'll go through that very shortly. But that's what makes it quite fascinating. But the message from this slide is that the endocannabinoid system is vitally involved in almost every aspect of human functioning. Okay. Okay, what's the purpose of the endocannabinoid system? Broadly speaking, its role is homeostasis. Homeostasis means keeping things in balance. Right? We have our temperature well controlled. We're not 40 degrees, we're not 33 degrees, we're 37 degrees. We have our blood pressure controlled. We have all these things controlled, and it appears that the endocannabinoid system interacts with the bigger systems or the outside systems. It's a system within a system, and that's why it actually impacts on so many different disease states, because it indirectly influences all the endocrine system, the digestive system and the immune system are all modulated and controlled by the endocannabinoid system. This is fascinating because in the course of my sort of learning with this, as we started treating children for life-threatening epilepsy, what we found was some of their ancillary problems, like their nasal allergies and their food intolerances and their eczema and things like that, started to disappear, which is very gratifying and still yet fully explained. But it's certainly not a simple silver bullet or a magic bullet the way the allopathic doctors push a drug to have one effect. And they're searching around trying to shoehorn the cannabis medicines into their magic bullet hypothesis, so a company can then market it and make a lot of money. But what they have to realise is that the endocannabinoid system is a vast system, and interactions in one thing, a perturbation, will affect something else. Now, just go on from that, we'll leave that. Sis? This is a diagram of a nerve. Now just imagine the nerve, what they call presynaptic. The synapses, you might know, is where the nerves interact with each other, where the axon of the downcoming nerve interacts with the dendrite of the other one and things flow. The normal way the physiology of the body works is this presynaptic, or the top part, the direction coming down like this, produces vesicles which contain neurotransmitters. Those neurotransmitters jump across the synaptic cleft to the postsynaptic bulb there, and they exert an effect. But what the endocannabinoid system does, I'll just get up and show you this. It actually starts at this end and it feeds back to regulate the production of something else. So it's actually, the system is running backwards. Right? It doesn't mean it always performs a negative function of damping things down. Equally, it can modulate things up. So the mystery with cannabis and the endocannabinoid system is how it works. Right? You've all heard of the endocrine system. The endocrine system out of our pituitary, which regulates our thyroid, our thymus, you know, the gonads, all these endocrine systems. Even though they're complicated, in principle they're really simple, because we know when your thyroid hormone level goes up, a suppressor is generated in the brain which then regulates down the thyroid, and the thing moves up and down between narrow limits. But the magic of the endocannabinoid system is no one really knows what's directing it. Now, the endocannabinoids, look at this, they're produced as needed. Now, no one, that's thrown in because no one really knows what is calling the shots on the system. But when you actually look at these things with advanced technology like EM microscopes and things like that, these endocannabinoids manifest out of a cell membrane, make their actions felt, and then disappear. And it might all be over in a couple of seconds, right? The whole body is a very dynamic interplay. Nothing stands still in the body. Things are being made and broken down. They're giving responses. They're being upregulated or downregulated, but it's quite a complex interaction. So they're produced as needed. Now, this is where it gets mysterious. Aces, just the next one. And to understand the endocannabinoid system properly, you've got to understand what our cells are made of. And the basic building block of our cells is what they call the lipid bilayer, right? Now, it's a phospholipid. See that phospholipid bilayer? Now, break down the words, right? Don't get frightened by the polysyllables. Phosphorus is the red dots, or represented by the red dots. They are water-soluble material. The lipids, represented by the little stalks there, are what they call hydrophobic. They don't like water, and they take whatever they can to get away from water. So when you have a polar molecule like a phospholipid, right, and you mix them together, they self-assemble to form a lipid bilayer. Now you can see why that's the case, because the phosphorus goes out looking for water and the lipids hide from water, and the only place they can hide is within the cell membrane. So that is a very simple idea of a cell membrane, but it belies the complexity of the whole system. Now the next one, please. The membrane in reality looks a lot more like that simple diagram, and even this is a gross simplification. So when we talk about an endocannabinoid receptor, what we mean is a protein structure that lives on either side of the cell membrane and is normally associated with a channel that runs through the membrane. So say, for instance, it's activated, it may lead to an influx or an outflux of calcium or sodium or potassium or whatever that particular one regulates. But that's how the endocannabinoid system actually impacts on the body. The important thing, though, is where the anandamide comes from. And you're all aware that anandamide is the old Sanskrit word for bliss, right? It was named by I think Ralph Matulam, because it did appear to be a molecule that induced a profound sense of bliss. So that's how it got its name. But the fascinating thing about this, unlike, say, thyroid hormone, which is made in a gland, or testosterone or estrogen, which are made in the ovaries or the testes, we've got a discrete site. Here, the anandamide produces itself, apparently, out of the cell membrane when it's needed, right? But these are very, very mysterious things to say, because where is the intelligence? We're conditioned to think our intelligence is a result of our brain working as a whole, all those nerves together and all that learning, and that's what gives us ideas. But it appears in the endocannabinoid system we have an example of cellular intelligence, right? It's very much like the analogy of a bee that knows how to build a hive and where to find flowers and how to direct and navigate without actually being told. The cells appear to have an intrinsic intelligence that can regulate their interaction with each other. And the endocannabinoid system, unlike the endocrine system, where an endocrine system will affect the whole body at once, the endocannabinoid system is exquisitely specific, and it works one cell at a time. Right? So it's not sending anandamide out to the whole body, it works locally on the next cell. Okay, so here's a little while ago, I think it was actually at a Mardi Gras, one of the American speakers introduced the concept of an endocannabinoid deficiency syndrome. And I must admit at the time I thought he was just being a bit clever, but the more we actually look at it, it does appear that a host of human diseases are the result of an endocannabinoid deficiency or an endocannabinoid dysfunction, right? Now, this is what you can do about it. There's no point in having a situation, but we can actually manipulate these things. The dietary intake of lipids influence the chemical makeup of your cell membrane. So say, for instance, you eat McDonald's hamburgers and Coca-Cola as your standard diet for 20 years. It's almost totally lacking in omega-3 and any of the better quality lipids. So when your cell membranes are made up, they can only be made up by what's put into the cake hole, as it were, and they end up with high levels of saturated fats. They're not fluid, electrically charged membranes, they're basically just saggy old bags. And from those cell membranes, if you don't have the right lipids in them, you can't manifest the right lipids out. So the diet and what you eat has a profound effect on the function of the endocannabinoid system. Right? So lipid deficiencies, the key lipids, and we'll be talking about the sources of those key lipids, will have a profound effect on whether your endocannabinoid system works well. In the same way, if you're short of iodine or you're short of any other thing, that system won't work. Well, your endocannabinoid system runs on quality lipids, right? Not saturated trans fats. They just can't do it, right? Okay, hemp seed. I hope you've all had experience with hemp seed nutrition by now, because if you haven't, I'll spend the rest of the time here convincing you that you should, right? Australia and New Zealand, just the next one, I think. Australia, the politics of the hemp seed. Australia and New Zealand are the only two countries on earth that have restrictions on the use of hemp seed as a human food, right? And the resistance in this country is profound. As long ago as 2002, our colleague Phil Warner put in application A360 to FSANZ, which is Food Standards Australia and New Zealand, to have hemp seed recognised as a novel food. But at that stage, Howard was Prime Minister and Abbott was Health Minister. No wonder we're so sick now. But they knocked it back. They wouldn't give it a consideration. Okay, I let the water settle for a little while, and in 2008, I made the next application, A1039. And a normal FSANZ application should be dealt with in 18 months. 6 years later, that's in February of this year, it came to the vote, and guess who voted it down? Yeah. It wasn't only Abbott. Unfortunately, there seems to be an unholy alliance between people cross parties. So we had to get the support of 6 of the states, right? We got 1. Tassie backed us. All right? I don't know why there's such an agreement between Liberal and Labor when it comes to this issue, but there does appear to be instructions coming from a higher level not to let it out of the bag. The good news is we've heard recently that despite the fact that the federal government knocked back our application in February, they're now looking to actually make some legislative change next year. It's not as good as this year, but it's better than nothing, and it does look like we'll join the rest of the world in the near future. The reason why it's so important to get hemp industries going, the hemp seed industry going, is it because it facilitates the creation of hemp industries in this country. We started agitating for industrial hemp in 1988 because it was very clear then we had a problem with forestry, erosion, not to mention greenhouse effect and all the other problems that are besetting us. They could all be significantly impacted by having an major industrial hemp movement. But to start it from a financial point of view, if we have to build a hemp industry that's going to make paper, for instance, you need something like $200 or $300 million to set up a mill, and we just don't have access to that sort of capital at this stage. So the critical thing was to get something modular, like a hemp seed industry. Now, with a hemp seed industry, a person can make a decent income from 10 or 20 hectares. So they don't need to raise huge amounts of capital to get the industry started. And then, using that as a priming for the pump, we can build up the area until we can actually do the large-scale industrial ones. So having hemp seed legislation is critical because it would increase the number of farmers planting a very, very profitable crop. Yeah, anyway, there is a bit of light at the end of the tunnel, but it's a shame that we've had to actually dip down so far before the rest of the world. for that to happen. Now, I'm going to talk briefly about, I'll just finish a little bit more on the hemp food. There's a lot of use of hemp seed oil at the moment, and people are taking it for its presumed nutritional benefits. And certainly it's a reasonably good oil, but it's not a practice that I actually advocate, right? And this is why. When you take the seed, remember the whole seed that you saw before, that has not only 30% oil, 30% protein, and a very rich mixture of what we call the cofactors that are needed to absorb omega-3 and utilise it into your brain and elsewhere. It has large amounts of B group vitamins and a lot of minerals, zinc and magnesium specifically, and vitamin E in very useful quantities. So when you eat hemp seed nutrition in the seed itself, you're getting the oil in a pure form, surrounded by its cofactors to assist in its utilisation and uptake. People started making hemp seed oil here because it wasn't permitted to eat the food, but it was allowed to be used topically. So the oil was actually forced into production by the laws at the time. Now, the problem with taking a seed and taking the oil to one side and leaving the protein cake on the other is you separate out the benefits of the plant, right? An oil that's taken away from its protein matrix very rapidly goes rancid. And the better the quality of the oil, whether it's chia or flax or hemp seed oil, they go rancid very, very quickly, in a matter of weeks, if they're not properly looked after. Whereas a seed has a shelf life at room temperature of a year and in the fridge of at least 2 years, right? So the purpose of not having oil as your primary intake of the hemp is that it's separated from its cofactors, and it's also very prone to rancidity. So you're doing yourself a disservice if you're taking hemp seed oil only and not hemp seed, especially in the form of smoothies or any other form of incorporating it into your diet. But certainly for children, we're encouraging the parents and the carers to make smoothies and getting the kids away from now what is fairly poisoned dairy products and moving them onto a much more nutritious and beneficial brain-building food. Okay, the types of cannabis. We're going to talk about various manners of extraction and various administrations. Thanks, Sis. Okay, I suppose everyone here is aware of the differences, of the appearance of the differences between indica and sativa. Okay, all right. Basically, and I don't want to get into an argument about how to classify cannabis, because every now and then someone comes up with a new scheme and all the rest of it. This is simple, but it's practical, right? As a rule, the indica plants, as you can see over there on the far right, are little squat plants that produce short, thick stems with short palmate leaves, whereas the sativa tends to be a lot more rangy and high growing. The usual explanation for the effects is they say that the indica has a sedating or a body stone and the sativa has a stimulating or a headstone. There's some truth in that, but it really is a matter of individual usage, and it's also influenced by the dose. But there are perceptible differences in the psychotropic effect of an indica and sativa, and often in therapeutics, when it's available, it's usually recommended that you may take a sativa drug during the day and an indica drug at night, right? So you can manipulate the differences of effects. There's been a lot of attempts at explanations as to why these things are different. Some people give the explanation that the indica may have some CBD in it. That's probably not true on the current population of Australian cannabis. Some years ago, when we had actually access to high-quality analytical equipment at Southern Cross University, we actually took 20 plants from around the place and looked at them, and the Australian drug supply at that stage had 0 CBD, so it was all THC. So the effects, the difference of effects between indica and sativa are probably explained by the differences in the terpenes, which appear to modulate the psychotropic effect at the higher levels, and whether they modulate the medical effects we've yet to find out, but there are indications that they do. Okay, that's just the same view again, the little indica plant there and the sativa plants there. Most of the drug supply in this country now is hybridised. There's very few pure indica and pure sativa. I was lucky 2 years ago to actually get access to pure indica and pure sativa from a very advanced seed bank, and we grew them out in a farm, and I was determined to do a chemical analysis of both of them and try and definitively work out the chemical basis of the differences. Unfortunately, the helicopter found them before they got to the analysis, and that question is still up in the air, which I wish the helicopters weren't. All right, what's the next one? Okay, the reason for growing cannabis, basically, it's a resin factory, right? The reason cannabis makes resin, no one's really sure. They say it's for protection against UV radiation, it might repel insects. We don't know. Other people say, well, the plant and humans co-evolved. These are all speculative things. But whatever it is, the plant produces these resin bodies called trichomes in the highest density on the flowers of the female. And that's really the reason for growing the cannabis. There is a movement around the place spearheaded by Dr. Courtney in the United States that looks at juicing fresh cannabis leaves. I'm not a massive adherent of that because I do feel that the medical effect of cannabis is a result of the cannabinoids and not something in the fan leaves. But let's take the next photo if you don't mind. Closer up, you can see the terpenes, are little mushroom-shaped bodies. In the case of CBD plants, and this is interesting because we're going to be distributing cuttings from the CBD plants over this summer to give people better access, because our attitude is that we don't feel we own any plants or any varieties that we get access to. They merely come through our hands so we can better distribute them. But with the CBD plants especially, most of the CBD appears to be generated in the last 2 weeks of their life. So it's important not to pick them too early because you'll be shortchanging the production of CBD. The evolution of the cannabis in these trichomes varies towards the end, and it really, just like any fruit or other food, it's only best when it ripens naturally. Okay? Now, cannabinoid profiles. This isn't very clear, but it's not that critical for the details because the information here is probably overreaching. It's an American site where they claim to have pinned down individual actions associated with individual cannabinoids. I do feel this is overreaching because it's often based on just 1 or 2 experiments or no experiments at all, as much an opinion as anything. But the facts remain very clear that the different cannabinoids influence the overall effect. Now, just to explain it very simply, THC, the major psychotropic cannabinoid, is dramatically modulated when you add CBD to it, right? THC in overdose has a range of side effects, right? I mean, you can provoke anxiety, you can produce paranoia, you can certainly exacerbate short-term memory deficit and things like that. But when you mix some CBD with the pot, even if you smoke it in large doses, you certainly have a psychotropic effect, but you don't have what we call being bent. Right, you can still, it's more a gentle stimulation and elevation of mood rather than having things sort of, perceptions distorted. So there is unequivocally an association between the different cannabinoids in terms of how they work. And unfortunately, because we live in a commercially driven world, the company like GW Pharmaceuticals is now trying to pick out 1 or 2, something like THCV, and say this is the one we're going to concentrate on for, say, epilepsy or whatever particular treatment they are. It's not a way forward that I like. I mean, I may be a medical scientist, but at my very heart, I'm also a herbalist. And I really prefer that cannabis is dealt with as a herbal medicine rather than a cash cow for a pharmaceutical company which wants to pull it apart and use it in a least effective way. Okay. Decarboxylation is a concept you've got to get your head around. It's not difficult. In the plant, cannabis, any of the cannabinoids occur in the acid form. Acid, if you remember from your high school days, just COOH, an acid group, is attached to the THC in a plant, so it's referred to as THCA or THC acid. When you heat the plant, especially by smoking, that carboxyl group is removed and you have the full psychotropic effect of the THC. Right? It's often said that THCA doesn't have psychotropic effect. This isn't true, But in the similar way to CBD, it does have a mood elevating property. It does have a perceptual a change in inducing a change in perception, but in the same way as just it doesn't have the same distorting effect on perceptions of time and other things like that. You can still get the flow of ideas, the associations, the lateral way of thinking. THCA has a lot to recommend it, right? Because it can be taken when needed in much higher doses than you can take THC, and it's still an open question as to which one has the major therapeutic effect, right? Whether it's THC or THCA, but I resolve that dilemma in my own mind by saying it's horses for courses. At some stage, you actually have to interact the drug with the patient and whatever their particular disorder is and see how it goes, right? There's arguments for and against different things, but there's no way outside of empirical trials that you can actually work out what's best for one individual person and their particular dysfunction at that time. Because remember, everyone's endocannabinoid system is quite distinct as well, as distinct as they are. So decarboxylation, there is a school of thought that says they use the word activation, without activating the THC, you don't get the therapeutic effect. I'm certainly not of that view, right? And that's not been my experience. Even in the traditional THC roles of spasticity and pain relief, what I've found is using THCA in the tincture, the patients, I've only used that recently, and I'll go into the production on that soon. The patients have been giving very, very positive feedback. So don't give up on THCA. I think there's a lot of therapeutic activity with very much fewer problems that you can get with high-dose THC therapy. Okay, terpenes. One of the fascinating things about cannabis, remember we said that the cannabinoids are diterpenes, two terpenes are brought together. The terpenes that are found in cannabis are also found in anything else that smells. They're found in mangoes, in roses, what we said, in lavender, in oregano. All these terpenes can occur in the hemp plant. And it's fascinating as to why that is, what such a range of terpenes. But no one has really come to a sort of a clear philosophical understanding of how this all came about and why cannabis is such an unusual and unique plant. But we'll just accept it for what it is. Okay. Now, even though I said I see myself basically as a herbal doctor, I'm still scientifically literate, and I still appreciate the need for detailed scientific inquiry and a rational approach to what we do. Now, there's several different ways of measuring cannabis. In the old days, by that I mean about the 1800s, and cannabis was widely used then in the old days, they used to give blocks of hash to beagle dogs and count how many times they fell over as a measure of how potent the hash was. That was called a bioassay, right? I mean, I don't know, but that's the way they did it. We moved forward a couple of hundred years, and now we have HPLC, or high performance liquid chromatography. This is a beautiful analytical technique that gives you a very precise qualitative, that means what cannabinoid it is, and quantitative, how much. So when you look here, you can see how they're labelled. We've got CBD on the left, we've got delta 9 there in the middle, and CBN on the far right, and the height gives a measure of the quantity, right? So it's a very, very useful technique. In happier days, and most people aren't aware, we made really good progress back in 2002, and a group of activists, myself and a group of activists here from Nimbin, actually got a license to grow drug cannabis as a preparation for medical. And we had a wonderful grow shed over at Corindi, and we had Southern Cross University working on doing our analysis, and everything was looking really rosy, and Mr. Carr's government seemed to have pulled the plug on that, and we've gone nowhere since. Unfortunately, the current government is of the same view. I've tried for 3 years to get Sydney Uni to do an analysis on the medicine that I'm using on sick children, and after 3 years of constant nagging, I'd have to say constant nagging, they finally rang me up 2 months ago and said, we're ready to do your samples, bring them in. So on the next train I was there with a briefcase full of samples, but unfortunately Kerry Chant the chief or the person imitating the chief health officer in New South Wales specifically prohibited Sydney Uni from doing any of the analysis from anyone that's not working within the system. And that's actually a bit of a blow. Kerry Chant was the same person that came up to Lismore and tried to sell the idea of fluoridating the water. So you can see where she's up to scientifically. Hey, sis? Okay. When you don't have HPLC, we come back 70 years ago to what we call thin layer chromatography. Now, this is the sort of access we've got now for testing, and as you can see, it's a little more imprecise, I suppose, and what we've got here is only semi-quantitative. It does very accurately set out, you can see the THC dots, you can see which of the plants have CBD, because each of the different ones migrate through different, through the medium or along the paper at different rates depending on their weight and their charge. It's a reasonable thing. If you want to take a herb and get an idea approximately of what its THC and CBD ratio is, you can use thin layer chromatography. And what I say, that in the kingdom of the blind, the one-eyed man's king, right? It's better to have TLC than nothing, although it's a long way from having a proper HPLC set up. And the fact that there's a going HPLC machine at Sydney Uni from which we're excluded is a source of ongoing anger for me, and something that won't be resolved until it's resolved in our favour. Okay. All right, methods of extraction. Now listen, at the moment, cannabis chemistry is more like cannabis cookery, and everyone's got their own particular view of how to do it, and nothing I say today can be considered definitive or the last word on the subject, right? This is a learning experience for everyone, and holding dogma excessively hard is as counterproductive as being completely ignorant. Right? We get dogma all the time, oh, THC is good, CBD is not good, oh, it must be decarboxylated, it must be this, or you must do that. There's a whole lot of stipulations that aren't really borne out, they're not really based on a solid factual basis. So what I'm saying now is just what we're doing at the moment, right? And as the science develops and as we get access to better analysis, that can guide us in what we do. Okay. Now, that is that's a pound of cannabis bought from the Sydney markets. It's 22%. It was a good cannabis, very, very carefully trimmed, but that cost the poor patient nearly $4,000, right? And on top of a serious illness, the cost of black market cannabis can be prohibitive. Okay, next. The famous solvent extraction to make oil. Now, firstly, this isn't a new procedure by any means, and I think it was someone up here last year that actually found an article in the Australian newspaper from 1857 which gave a recipe for making hemp oil, which is not widely different from the recipe we're currently using. So it's really back to the future. Remember, in the 1800s, the main drugs for pain and things are opium and cannabis, right? And yeah, cannabis oil was widely used for a range of conditions. Now, I'll just go back to that one if you don't mind. There's a few issues with the oil, right? Because it depends what solvent you use. And there's the supporters have their views on whether you should use alcohol or isopropyl or shellite or what else, acetone. Most of the solvents are adequate in terms of their extraction, and the big issue in people's minds are the residual solvents, right? And the argument is because alcohol is theoretically a potable product, it's better to use the alcohol than the isopropyl or the hexane. Now, there's some merit in that argument, but the problem is when people do alcohol extractions carelessly, right, you can bring out a lot from the plant that's not cannabinoids. Remember, we just want cannabinoids, but alcohol is water and lipid soluble, so it brings out a lot of water soluble things. It dissolves a lot of the plant waxes, and I've been shown oils that people go, oh, here's my oil, and this thick, disgusting black tar comes out, and you really wonder how they can expect to get better on that sort of preparation. The one thing that I've found quite useful if you're going to do a solvent extraction is to actually put the solvents and the herb in a freezer, right? I'm not against using isopropyl if that's the way it goes. It's not my favourite, and the time that I use isopropyl is if I luckily find myself out in the middle of a huge patch of pot. We actually wash the plants fresh in isopropyl in 20-litre buckets and then evaporate that off, and you can get a very beautiful oil. The quality of the oil can be basically assessed by its colour, right? The beautiful golden honey oil tends to be higher potency and a much greater purity than the black oils. Right, because the black oils are made black by the oxidation of extraneous material because of careless extractions. Right, doing it in the freezer at -4 degrees reduces the extraction of water soluble, but it doesn't prevent it. Okay. This is a sonicator. It's also known as a jury cleaner, and it's most commonly used as a jury cleaner. It really is just a heated metal box that can be vibrated at 40,000 cycles a second. Right, so it's used in the laboratories to assist in dissolving things. Just imagine if you want to dissolve your sugar in your cup of tea, you stir it with a spoon, but you imagine you put it at 40,000 cycles a second, it dissolves a lot quicker. So to make the current medicine we're using in children, the epileptic medicine for children, we basically put 100 grams of our chosen herb. At the moment I'm using Z7, which is a 15:1 CBD to THC ratio, 100 grams of the herb and a litre of oil. Now I mostly use MCT or medium chain triglyceride oil. Now for people who don't know, coconut oil is made up of 60% medium chain triglycerides and 40% long chain triglycerides. Now it's the long chain triglycerides that make the coconut oil go hard at room temperature, right? It also increases the metabolic energy needed to absorb it. To absorb long chain fats takes more metabolic energy and longer time than absorbing medium chain triglycerides. And in fact, MCT or medium chain triglycerides are absorbed passively. So if you just put them on your mucosa or even on your skin, they're absorbed passively into the body, and that's quite a useful way of actually formulating. This form of preparation is useful to make a fairly low concentration. So when I'm providing for, say, a 3 or 4 year old child, we sonicate this up, and I usually soak it for 24 hours, and during that 24 hours we sonicate it 3 times, just to make sure we have the maximum amount of extraction. The beauty of doing it this way, compared to solvents, is very little extraneous stuff actually comes out, because the water-soluble things aren't soluble in the oil like they are in the alcohol. So you end up with a fairly pure extraction, and we've actually verified this by analysis that was conducted overseas. So the sonicator, the reason why I actually developed it was I was trying to give the government something that was so far removed from any sort of suggestion of drug culture that they'd find it easier to go forward with it as a method of production, but unfortunately it hasn't worked, right, because there is an ideological block. This has got nothing to do with science or genuine concern. It's a malicious ideological block to progress of natural medicines over allopathic medicines. Okay. All right, the other way is a dry ice resin extraction. Now, I'm a bit of a Johnny-come-lately on this one. Even though it was all over the internet, I hadn't heard about it until about 6 months ago, when someone actually brought a bag and says, "You've got to see this, Andrew." I have to say I was pleasantly amazed at the dry ice extraction. Right? Now, there are a few provisos. Is everyone here familiar with that, or will I go through it? No, okay. Look, you basically use bubble bags, which are basically just some form of plastic bag with a membrane underneath of a known grid width. And they vary from 23 microns up to about 120 microns. And the idea is you get the pellets of dry ice, which are at -80 degrees, and you put a carpet of the dry ice down the bottom of the bag, and then a carpet of trimmed dry bud. And I was told it works on fresh bud. It definitely doesn't, or it doesn't work very well, so don't waste your time with that. Carefully trimmed dry bud, and then another carpet of dry ice. You leave it to chill down to -80, and then you simply agitate it, shake it up and down onto a hard glass surface preferably. And the golden resin, those trichomes that you saw, comes fluttering down into a beautiful golden... Let's look at the next one, yes? Well, it depends. I'll show you. It depends what you want, right? I mean, there's a degree of conceit in the United States where some people will only do 23 micron hash. You know, that's what we do. I generally use about 45 because it's the best. You can also you start at the small one and you go up. And as you extract, it goes from a beautiful golden colour, which is just the trichomes, but as you start to break up the plant itself, then it turns green. And you know you've passed the best. Right? For our medical work, we use 45 because we're getting most and not getting too much leaf material. So it's a trade-off between quality and quantity, basically. 23, you'll get a tiny amount of the best. 45, you'll get a fair bit of good. And at higher than that, you get a lot of leaf thrown in. So it's just a balance. No, because it depends how you agitate it. You can end up with leaf in it just by going too long, even in a fine bag. What we do, we basically scalp it to get the trichome, so we don't agitate too hard, just scalp it, take the best, and then you may use what's left in a solvent extraction or a butane extraction. Right, so say you've got a particularly sensitive child that you don't want to have anywhere near a solvent, you use that for them, and you use that for either topical use or an adult. Right, so that way you don't have to be too quantitative about it. You just take in the best, but using the rest. Okay, resin is fantastic. I'm a fan. A few provisos there. If the herb is not very good, right, and by that I mean if it's significantly less than, say, 10% of total cannabinoids, you'll get a very disappointing result because unlike solvents, it won't pull the cannabinoids out of the leaf material, it'll only physically remove the trichomes. So unless you've got really good bud, really heavily resonated bud, it's not worth doing this, you'll be disappointed. Okay, so it's not a universal application, and like I said before, you can do it both ways. You can take the resin for a particular sort of medicine and then use the rest. You can use the rest in your biscuit making, for instance, so you don't have to waste anything. It's just a way of separating it out physically. Okay. Okay, methods of administration. Now, basically you can eat it, you can smoke it, you can, what we do, the back door, or you can do it topically. Now, of ingestion, it can either be mucosal or gastric, and there's a few sequelae of how you ingest it as to what actually happens, right? If you're eating it, when you eat something, it goes through your stomach, through the intestine, and then it's picked up by the portal circulation and it goes through the liver. When cannabis, or THC specifically, goes through the liver, remember it's delta 9 THC, the body hydroxylates in it and it becomes 11-hydroxy THC, which actually has more of a psychotropic effect than delta 9 and a psychotropic effect that is of longer duration than delta 9. So that explains that explains why eating it is more likely to lead to a green out or to an unexpected sort of exaggerated response down the track. There is a delay, sometimes up to 2 hours between the intake and the effect, and that makes it hard to titrate. Eating does have a place for people who are on a stable dose and have worked that out over time. So there is a place for that, and there may be a place for the 11-hydroxy, but it's a question of horses for courses and what suits people. Some people do very well on biscuits, others won't do well at all, and you just have to work that out. Mucosal absorption, that's operating on the assumption that if something is absorbed passively through your mucosa, it doesn't go through the liver, but it goes directly into the systemic circulation, so it's not subject to 11-hydroxylation. And often the recommendation is that if you have an oil or a tincture, you hold it in your mouth for as long as possible, and that is the reason for doing that, so it doesn't go through the liver and it's not generated into a more psychotropic effect. Inhalation, I mean, smoking is an interesting thing, right? There's a lot of do-gooders saying, and Bob Carr being one of them, oh, you know, we can't have anyone smoking here. You've got to breathe diesel fumes and all sorts of volatile poisons in the atmosphere, but you can't voluntarily inhale a herb. Now, the theory goes that because cannabis has 400 more times tars and carcinogens than cigarettes, it must be more dangerous. Now, the only problem with that is that it's actually not true. Right? Now, 4 years ago, a professor of respiratory medicine in America, Dr Tashkin, was tasked by the NIH, the National Institute of Health, to prove that cannabis caused lung cancer. Right? This is how unbiased science works in the United States. Anyway, Dr Tashkin was given a budget and said, go out and show us that pot smoking causes cancer. And he did a very, very thorough study. At least the man can be given credit for doing a thorough epidemiological study. But at the end of 3 years, he published his results, and he said not only does smoking cannabis not give you lung cancer, but cannabis smokers have 30% less cancer generally. So it appears to exert a protective effect. Now, the NIH were furious and made Tashkin take his paper off their website, and luckily that provoked enough reaction from people, and now it's back on, and you can check what I say on the web. So I'm not that fussed by smoking. I mean, I smoke myself. I don't consider it a big issue, but it comes down to dose and what you smoke it with, right? There's a big issue with tobacco. What can I say there that's balanced? I actually smoke tobacco, but I'm particularly sensitive about the quality of tobacco, and anything that comes out of a tailor-made packet can't be called tobacco in the same way as a McDonald's food can't be called food, right? It's some bizarre parody of what used to be. And remember, they add things like ammonia to the tobacco to make the nicotine more rapidly absorbed, so you come back and get another packet of Winfield, right? There's a big argument made that the cannabis nowadays is much more potent than it was when the hippies were around, and that's why we're getting psychosis and things. Again, that's not true, because if you're worried about the danger of smoking, it's much better to have 2 puffs of a 15% weed than 30 puffs of a 4% weed to get the same effect. So high quality pot, smoking through a reasonable device, or smoking even through a cigarette in small quantities, is not dangerous. It's certainly associated with a bit of a redness of your mucosa, but it certainly doesn't have any long-term effects either on cancer itself, lung cancer, or on emphysema. Right? There's no clear association of cannabis smoking and emphysema. Okay, now the different methods of suppositories. Oh no, sorry, vaping. We're up to vaping. So smoking may have a place. Its advantages are the rapid onset and the ability to titrate. So say you're dealing with a spasm situation or a pain situation, you can sit there and draw on your cigarette until that goes away, and you can titrate your dose, and that's a very useful strategy. Vaporizing, there has been an explosion of vaporizing technology over the last couple of years, and there's some really... When we started experimenting with vaporizing about 15 years ago, I mean, looking back at the things we did, they look sort of comical now. We used to get soldering irons and stick them into glass jars and things like that. They worked, but compared to volcanoes and vape pens and things like that now, we're really looking at the horse and buggy days in our vaporizing. There's a lot to be said for vaporization, right? Both in the vaporizing of the herb and the vaporizing of the concentrates like bubble or oil or anything like that. There's a lot to be said for it. It's a convenient method. Right? With some of the small portable vape pens, you can actually use it in public, even in buildings and sitting at restaurant tables without it being too obvious and without there being any smell. So for people that rely or need frequent administration, having a little pocket vape pen and some high quality oil is a very viable way to go. It's also very much more bioavailable. Now, each of these methods is associated with different amount of bioavailability. By that I mean, of the ingested dose, how much of that ends up in your bloodstream. Now with eating, it can be as low as 10%. So 90% of the herb that you eat doesn't actually get into your bloodstream. With vaporizing, it can be 3 times that. So if you're dealing with a problem with finances and things like that, there can be an efficiency associated with vaporizing. But having said that, some people may prefer the oral effect, and it really does come down to people finding out what suits their particular condition. You can mix and match them. It doesn't mean you can do one or the other. You might have a biscuit in the morning and vape at night. These things can be worked out by the patient, and the thing that I find most offensive about the way the health system and the political system treat human beings is they treat them like a nanny state. These people are incapable of regulating their own pharmacological intake. That's not true. All the patients that I've interacted with, and there's hundreds now, can very rapidly learn what suits them best. Our role is merely to present them with options from which they can then, by experience, decide on what suits them the best. Okay, suppositories. There's a place for suppositories, and the theory was based basically on the fact that the first few inches of the rectum aren't drained through the portal circulation, so the theory goes you can give relatively large doses without there being a disabling psychotropic effect. That's what the literature says. In practice, that's not quite true, and I've had a few patients green out quite significantly, even with suppository administration. Part of the explanation for that is there's only a narrow part of the rectum that doesn't drain via the liver, and if you go a little bit beyond that area, it goes through the liver and it's exactly the same as eating it. But again, it's horses for courses. There's a whole range of preparing, either just using the oil in a syringe or using coconut oil and solidifying the suppositories. For conditions, say for instance ulcerative colitis or Crohn's disease with anal fistulas, that's the way to go. We combine topical application as well as systemic treatment. Topical is an undeveloped resource. It's very obvious now that the cannabinoids can be absorbed through the skin, especially when they're complexed with medium chain triglycerides and possibly with other oils. I've certainly experimented with olive oil, but I just find it a little heavier than the MCT, and I don't think it's absorbed quite as well. So we're going with the MCT at the moment. Now, in my practice, I've used topicals as an emergency intervention in a seizing child where an oral administration isn't possible, and we've only been in that situation where we were actually hands-on while it was happening a couple of times, but it did seem to be like a worthwhile endeavour. The next situation that I found myself in is treating very young children with very, very advanced cancers. And it's been a real problem with any of these methods in actually getting enough cannabis into the child to make a difference. And at the sort of doses that we feel may be necessary for a cancer response, the amount of gastric intolerance and just difficulty of actually eating that much is quite high. And it has been a problem with the last few, especially the little children that are a bit fussy, and well, I suppose it's just a big ask. If anyone's tried to eat a raw bud or a piece of cannabis, it's not a particularly flavoursome thing in its oral form. The next paediatric cancer patient that comes my way will probably be treated by an intensive topical regime. We'll produce the cannabis in equal blends of THC and CBD and give them daily or bi-daily whole body massages. So I'd be very interested to see how that works, because I do feel we can give fairly large doses in a relatively innocuous way, and at the same time having the physical contact with the patient, which I think is an important part of their overall healing. Okay. No. All right. Okay. Okay, medical uses. This is a tiny, tiny little list, I mean, of things. I don't know how many of you saw the Insight program run by Jenny Brocky a few months ago when they were actually covering the idea of medical cannabis. But she objected to my suggestion that there probably wasn't a significant human health condition on Earth that wasn't in some ways responsive to cannabis therapy. And she objected on the basis that nothing can be that good. But if the underlying disease processes all result from a dysfunction of the regulatory system, the endocannabinoid system, you can have one medication that can affect a whole range of very, very unrelated conditions. I mean, you might ask, what does paediatric epilepsy and Crohn's disease have in common, apart from the fact that they both respond dramatically to CBD-dominant cannabis? My attitude in science is you look for the effect first and the explanation second. You don't put the cart before the horse. Okay, thanks, Sis. All right, the big question and what everyone wants to know, does cannabis cure cancer? Now, at this stage, to use a hackneyed phrase, the jury is still out. This is my experiences so far. About 2 years ago, I was confronted by a lady who I'd been providing some sort of, I suppose you call it naturopathic healthcare, dietary healthcare, during a 16-year battle with breast cancer, and we'd kept her going quite a while just with dietary strategies and things like that, but it got out of hand and the cancer actually invaded into her arm, into her brachial plexus, which is the big nerve that governs the arm. And not only was the arm paralysed, but she was faced with intolerable neuropathic pain. Neuropathic pain is the pain derives from damaged nerves. And she and her family arrived on my doorstep on one Sunday morning, everyone in tears, mum sort of, thrashing around in pain, saying the doctor said she's going to die, what can you do? At that stage, Rick Simpson oil wasn't very much used. This was a few years ago now, and that packet of pound that I showed you was what we went and got for her, and I made up the Rick Simpson oil using we used the hexane extraction then. And because of the desperate nature of the situation, I really dosed her immoderately, I'd have to say. It was very, very, very heavy dosing. And she spent 18 to 20 hours unconscious on a couch. But within 10 days, the pain in the arm had stopped, and over the next few weeks, she regained function of her arm. Right? Now, I thought, my word, it's all over. We've got the answer. And I went on to treat 5 more patients in the same way, and none of them responded. Right? So we're nowhere near at the end of it. And what I've come to appreciate is health and disease is a very complex interaction between the environment, the individual, their conditioning, and the therapeutic options that are aware to them. And it's very hard to make generalisations about anyone. Now, there is no doubt whatsoever that there's huge indicators of efficacy or indicators of positive action of cannabis against cancer, right? It's done, the models that have been investigated, we use either tissue culture, where you actually get the cancer cells growing in a petri dish, or you inject those cancer cells into into an immune deficient animal, and then you develop a human cancer on a mouse or whatever other animal you care to do. And in those tissue culture and animal models, various forms of cannabis have demonstrated dramatic anti-cancer effects. Now, unlike chemotherapy, when chemotherapy drugs, like cytotoxic drugs, and remember, most people aren't aware, who knows where chemotherapy got its start from? Is anyone aware? No, gas attacks from the First World War, right? The Germans threw some mustard gas at the British, and the British surgeons noticed that the bone marrow had been wiped out and said, oh, why don't we give this to leukemic patients? Which they did, and admittedly, it had a good effect for the first couple of weeks. But then because of the destruction of the immune system, they went on to relapse and die. But yeah, chemotherapy has grown out of gas warfare from the First World War, so it's not a very salubrious way to actually develop a therapeutic. Now, I really do want to stress that first thing, does cannabis cure cancer? There is always the primacy of prevention over treatment, right? If you want to cure cancer, don't get it in the first place. Now, I know that's a glib thing to say, and there's different types of cancer. There's the cancers that are unequivocally associated with lifestyle. Right? The small cell lung cancer associated with smoking, the thyroid cancer associated with radiation exposure. There's some, even the breast cancer to a point associated with being overweight and having high animal fat intake in your diet and things like that. There's clear things. There's other tumours, especially in 3-year-olds or others, that have no clear environmental trigger, and you don't know what's actually going on. There's a lot of possibilities. The doctors at this stage are saying, we don't know why you've got cancer, and they seem to abrogate the individual responsibility. What is cancer? As you all know, cancer is the uncontrolled growth of cells and the lack of what they call contact inhibition. Normally when cells grow, once they start touching each other, they stop growing. That's contact inhibition. Cancer doesn't have contact inhibition, and it just goes on and on like that. Now, the biology of cancer is not very well understood, and there's a lot of misconceptions, which has led to some strange treatments. The first one is that cancer is monoclonal. That means it's got one cell type that's gone bad. When you start to look at the cancers more carefully, it's clearly polyclonal. That means you're dealing with more than one cell line. So often when you receive treatment with radiation or chemotherapy or some other form of therapy, it can work very effectively against one of the clones, but not against the others. So the usual pattern of having chemotherapeutic treatment is you'd normally get an excellent response. You've got big lumps coming out of your body, and doc gives you the weed killer into your arm, and the things go away and say, oh look, mum's tumour's getting smaller. That's what happens. Normally, in the first untreated cancer, something like 90% of the cells are sensitive to whatever treatment you give them. But what's left, the ones that are left, the 10%, are now resistant. And if you've been irradiated, it's worse than that. The radiation actually develops what they call resistant cancer stem cells. And they go on to repopulate the recurrence or the relapse with resistant cells. So the next dose of treatment that you give has to be much more toxic in much higher levels to even get the same result. And the result of treating with chemotherapy or radiation is the bouncing ball effect. The first result, the ball bounces nice and high. The second one, it bounces about half, and then about a quarter, and then barely at all. And that's the response of chemotherapy. It's really, with very few exceptions, and those exceptions would be testicular cancer and Hodgkin's lymphoma, which appear to have long-term responses. By that I mean more than 10 years. Most of the chemotherapy is an evanescent effect, right? That means it works for a while, but then it ceases to be effective. In just the same way as we've overused antibiotics, and now we have a whole suite of resistant germs that don't respond to the antibiotics, in the same way with the cancer, after they've been exposed to an agent or two, they develop resistance. It's not a static thing. It's an adaptive, infiltrating sort of entity that learns from what you do to it and takes efforts to evade both your immune system and the chemicals and the radiation that's thrown at it. So, hang on, models of cancer, clinical case reports. There are a couple of well-documented case reports of dramatic responses to cancer. Probably one that should have got a lot more attention than it did was in the Johns Hopkins Hospital. This is on the internet. A 14-year-old boy had what they call a Philadelphia positive, chromosome positive acute lymphoblastic leukemia, which is a particularly nasty hematological malignancy, right? And this kid was in Johns Hopkins University Hospital, where they treat like what we call cavalier treatment. He was receiving enormous doses of chemotherapy. Anything they had, they were giving to him in series. Now, your white cells should be below about 11,000. His white cells were 300,000. Right, so it gives you an idea of the extent of his disease. And with all the chemotherapy, the leukemic cell index was going up on treatment, and that's a real, what we call a negative prognostic indicator. It usually means there's no hope at all. Now, the family, as is often the case in these dying times, said, we really want to try cannabis. And after the usual sort of foot dragging and things like that, they decided that, yeah, the kid was obviously dying, so what harm was there? And they gave him some cannabis oil for a week, and there was very little change in his state. And then they changed to a different oil, and over the next 5 days, there was a daily and major stepwise reduction. Right? He'd experienced a major tumour response. Unfortunately, on the 5th day, he died as a result of a hemorrhage which had been induced by the prior chemotherapy. Now, as a measure of how scientifically corrupt the people are at the Johns Hopkins, they didn't analyse the cannabis oil, the second cannabis oil. Now, to me, that's tantamount to, I mean, it's a crime against humanity, because it's clear now there are different combinations of cannabinoids that have more or less effect. Some oils do some good and some oils don't. And at this stage, we can't know what. But at that particular individual case, we had a chance to look at the differences between a non-effective and an effective treatment, and that's been lost for all eternity. Now, you just look at the science of the people that oppose us. Here, someone said, oh, yeah, we got a response to cannabis. I said, well, what was in it? What was it? It's like saying we got a response to tablets, right? It's just pathetic that scientists can behave in this way. It's just as the same as say, oh, cannabis does this or that. It really does depend, and we have to get a lot more subtle and a lot more detailed in the way we actually view medical cannabis, because there's very, very significant differences. Now, the difference between a tumour response to cannabis and a tumour response to chemotherapy is massive. When you give someone chemotherapy, the cells that are affected die by the process of necrosis. Necrosis simply means death, because the cells swell up and burst, and it's quite a messy and inflammatory condition. When cells interact with cannabinoids, they don't go through necrosis, they go, actually we'll have the next slide I think, they go through a process called apoptosis or autophagy. And these are basically physiological processes. So when you're a little embryo in utero, remember your hands start off as a little blob, and then by the process of apoptosis, they're actually remodeled. The extra skin is cut away. So the apoptosis is, they call it cell suicide. You can say that, but what it is, it's an energy-dependent process where the cell actually pumps out its own fluid. It's a bit like you sort of open a tap and squeeze out all the fluid, and the cell goes from this size to this size, and then it's just taken up by immune cells and recycled. The beauty of it is it involves no inflammation. It's a very tidy process, and it completely leaves alone normally transformed cells. So if you have, say, 50% cancer cells, 50% fibroblasts in a petri dish, and you put the cannabinoids in, you'll delete the cancer cells without affecting transformed cells, like normal cells. And that's a huge difference between that and most of the chemotherapeutic agents. The other important effect of cannabis is the inhibition of angiogenesis. Angiogenesis just means the development of new blood supply, right? When you've got a tiny tumour, less than a couple of millimetres, it doesn't need a blood supply because all the nutrients can infuse into it. But to get bigger, to get more than a couple of centimetres, it has to make blood vessels grow. And if you can stop the blood vessels from growing, you can choke off the tumour or slow up its growth. Now, the allopathic doctors are developing various antibody things aimed at attacking the angiogenesis factors, but they haven't had a good clinical response. With cannabis, it appears to be, let me try and make this balanced. In all the patients we've treated, we've only seen a couple of dramatic remissions, right? But in many of them, we've seen a significant slowing of the disease. And so many times the doctors said, I've got 3 months to live, and 2 years later they're still coming to see us for their oil and things like that. There is no doubt cannabis slows up the growth of tumour. Whether it's a direct effect on the tumour itself or by enhancing the person's well-being and recruiting their immune system against it, it may be both. The other thing is increased intracellular adhesion. Now the cells in our body, all the cells in our body are joined by these little things called desmosomes, and they stick the cells together. But with age and junk food and all the other things, the gaps between our cells get loose, and it makes it relatively easy for metastases to take root. With cannabis, it has a clear effect of increasing intracellular adhesion, and it basically shoulders the mets out. So these are effects we've seen, the slowing of the rate of metastases and the growth of the tumours. And our mission at the moment is to refine our therapeutics to actually increase the rates of actual remission that we get. Okay, why are we not getting better results than we're getting in the field of cancer treatment? My particular bias is that most of the people that come to us, firstly, they're usually coming at the end of 3 or 4 cycles of chemo and a bit of radiation, and they're suffering from severe long-term hyponutrition with multiple significant deficiencies, specifically omega-3, iodine, zinc and selenium, and many others. Now, I'll talk about those because they're all important. I'll come back to that. The other thing, and probably the main stumbling block to people's wellness, is that they're prisoners to their own habits. And those habits can be habits of behaviour or habits of thought. There's nothing more corrosive to the human psyche than negative thoughts, whether they're coming from outside, but more specifically if they're coming from inside. And when you actually use kinesiology to test people to see what their belief and whether they get better or not, a lot of people are plagued by fear and doubts about their outcomes, and that almost guarantees a negative outcome. Now, I know it's hard to keep a positive outlook when you're confronted by a malignant growth, but what else can you do? Okay, especially radiation generates these resistant cancer stem cells, and in many cases they make the treatment almost guaranteed to fail. The problem with radiation, as in the problem with chemo, is you do get an initial good effect. And from time to time, very regrettably, we've had to send some of our less successful patients along for focused radiation to control things like particularly painful bony mets, or a situation where it might be critical on their nervous system or something like that. But normally by the time we've done that, we've accepted the fact that we're not going to have a cure and we're into holding mode. But radiation, short-term gain, but long-term pain by a long way. With the chemotherapy, it not only affects the tumour, it affects every cell in your body, and that's witnessed by the fact that your hair falls out, your gut passes blood and all the rest of it, you're infertile. But from a cancer fighting point of view, if you don't have a highly honed digestive system and a very effective immune system, you're really not going to win. And that's why chemotherapy can't win, because it doesn't recognise the fact that the cancer and the human host, the reluctant human host, is in a relationship with each other, and you can't treat one without looking at the factors in the other. And it's without a digestive system to nourish the body and an immune system to delete the cancers, your treatments are only going to be of limited effectiveness at the best of times. Some tumours appear to lack receptors, CB1 and CB2 receptors. Now, very little work has been done on that, but the way I see things going forward is that once someone has a tumour biopsy, in the future, I'd like to think we'll do CB1 and CB2 assays on them at that stage and direct the people with high density of receptors straight to us, rather than let them go through a whole lot of other treatments before they come to us at a stage when it's where it's likely to be less effective. Now, the big question there is it only via the CB1 and 2 receptors that the cannabis has its effect? And the answer is a resounding no. It seems to have 3 different effects, right? Operating on the receptor is the first one, and that appears to maturate the cell. It'll either cause it to commit suicide, or it'll make it go back to a more normal cell. The fact that cancer can be cured by cannabis is very well illustrated by our treatment of basal cell carcinomas. Basal cell, or BCCs, are a very common form of skin cancer. We started experimenting with BCCs because even though they can be very destructive and grow very large, they don't metastasize. So we're not going to put people at risk. For instance, I wouldn't use cannabis treatment topically on a melanoma. I don't think that's wise at this stage. Even though it may influence the surface ones, it's probably, in my mind at this stage, the melanomas are much better dealt with by primary surgical excision, hopefully in an expert unit. Because melanomas are different than a lot of cancers. Once they get to a certain depth, they will metastasize, and the metastases are difficult to deal with. So unlike some people that slather them with black salve and a whole lot of other potents and unguents, I really take a great deal of care and respect with melanomas. With BCCs, we don't have to, because we know if we fail and they get out of control, you can always go back to a surgeon and have it grafted if necessary. But that hasn't been necessary, and the way it's worked for us, it's gone the other way. We're getting the people that the surgeons have rejected. And we've got a famous case that we treated early this year. The lady came in and she had a hideous BCC. She was about 70, a country girl, and had been there for years. I'd been meaning to get something done about this. But by the time she finally went to see a surgeon, he looked at her and said, "Christ, lady, we're going to have to amputate your nose." Right? That's a big thing, especially if you're wearing glasses, mate. You try it without. But yeah, it's a hideous deformity. And she said, "Well, what can you do?" And I said, "Look, give us a month, see how we go." And long story short, yeah, she got better. Right? It's funny, yeah, but wait, you go back to the doctors. It's not me, mate, it's a herb, right? Don't forget that. Anyone can put the herb on. She went back to the doctors. They don't want to know about it. I had one patient, she had breast cancer. Admittedly, it was only an early stage. We got a needle biopsy on it. It was an early stage breast cancer with no nodes. And so we went on, we didn't even use cannabis in her, just an intensive nutritional weight loss program. 6 months later, she went back to the surgeon, had the repeat ultrasound, a repeat examination, and the husband looked at him and says, "Well," he says, "there's no cancer." And the husband said, "Would you like to know what we've done?" He says, "I've got no interest." He said, "You can go now." Right? This is a sort of closed-mindedness that is leading to the situation we're in, an ideologically rather than scientifically driven medical system. Okay, the next thing is a poor quality and quantity of herb. And that's sad. I mean, we're all aware that there's a undercurrent of rip-offs going on in the pseudo-medical industry. There is, and I recognise, a growing army of compassionate people that are risking their own life and freedom to produce medicine for people. I don't think they need a pat on the back. I think it's just a self-obvious thing to do. But there are others that don't. And sick and vulnerable people are being ripped off, both by the fact that the black market prices and the fact that people are making medical preparations of very poor quality. And that's certainly responsible for some of the failures. Okay, the politics of cannabis. Now, does anyone recognise what that is? That's an American herbicide plane flying Agent Orange over Vietnam. Now remember, does everyone know what this is all about? Back in the 60s, the Viet Cong were basically winning the guerrilla war because they could go and hide in the jungle, and they used the Ho Chi Minh Trail to sort of bring supplies in from the north. The Americans' way around that, I think they dumped something like 23 million litres of this Agent Orange herbicide on the jungles and deforested a huge amount of the country. Now, the politics of these people, I think it was made by Dow or Monsanto, I'm not sure. They took shortcuts in the manufacture of this material, the 2,4-T and the 2,4-D, and heavily contaminated it with dioxin. Dioxin is the most potent chemical carcinogen known to man. Right, literally a cupful could wipe out Australian population if it was distributed that way. It's bizarre in its longevity and its potency to cause disease. Worse than that, dioxin causes diseases in the germline. There's a difference between a process that causes a disease in the subject, but this one causes a disease in the subject's children and those children's children. So we're seeing Agent Orange victims now, 3 generations post-exposure. Right? There's 5 million Vietnamese children affected by this now. This is the politics of the people that gave you the prohibition. We're dealing with sociopaths. Right? It's no point in calling it anything else. I say we live in a pharmaco-fascist society. They've used drug policy to control the people, and it's very much a case in the health system of the fox minding the pigeons. I feel there is unequivocal evidence that they have consciously degraded the food supply and made us vulnerable to cancer, and then peddling snake oil cures at us in the form of chemotherapy and radiation. Listen, I've mentioned snake oil cures. The irony, as it turns out, the original snake oil salesman used to peddle an extract of the Chinese water snake, and it turned out to be 20% omega-3. So it's likely that the snake oil salesman did a lot more good than Eli Lilly and Roche and all the other buggers in their suits. Okay. Politics are a big thing though. Now we're seeing a breakdown of the prohibition. There's no doubt there's cracks in the edifice. It happens that we live in one of the right-wing countries, right-wing by default. Unfortunately, Australia's become an iron fist with a velvet glove. So it looks like a relaxed, laid-back thing, a bit of a nanny state. In fact, it's a pharmaco-fascist state. And we're seeing worrying signs. The rollout of the Draeger saliva machines is a bizarre backward step in this country, because I think the right-wing forces are actually using saliva testing as a way of controlling things, even if they lose the battle about medical and recreational cannabis. They say, yeah, you can have your medicine, mate, but we'll catch you on the street and we'll take your driver's licence away. The only way around that, we have to, and we must become more vocal in our opposition to the saliva test for a number of reasons. The first reason is they don't contribute to traffic safety. And the only reason for doing these things is for traffic safety. The only type of test that influences traffic safety are impairment-based tests. And the old thing of drawing the chalk line and getting you to walk along it is a better test than a saliva test. The saliva tests that are used in Australia were tested in Europe and discounted and discontinued on the basis that they were unreliable. They gave too many false positives. That means they showed up positive when you should not have been positive. And they're a major incursion against a person's right to move about. By testing just the saliva, and usually for cannabis, and remember they don't test for pharmaceutical drugs like benzodiazepines, like Valium, or like antihistamines, or like the sleeping tablets, which are very clearly represented in fatal traffic accidents. Right? So we're completely off the track, and now is a time, before these things become entrenched, to make a lot of noise and organise resistance against this, or we'll find ourselves in a situation where we win the battle and lose the war. Okay, it really is something that I worry a lot about. Okay, okay, models for progress. Now I repeat my assertion that the prohibition is problem, not the plant. And once that is borne in mind, there is no point in just letting the door open a little bit. Right? The basic underlying assumption in the government is, oh, it's still a dangerous plant, you'll still get psychosis, but looks like some of it helps medically. That's not the way it is. Cannabis, in all its forms, is the safest therapeutically active substance known to mankind. I can say that without fear of contradiction, both in terms of its LD50, and I'll explain that to you so you can involve yourself in arguments with others. LD50 stands for the lethal dose that'll kill half the population exposed to it. Right? With alcohol, say you have the normal social intake of alcohol might be 5 drinks, say that's 50 grams of alcohol. If you have 3 times that or 4 times that, you're at significant risk of dying. So the LD50 is 4, a relatively modest number. With something like water, if 2 litres is your intake and you have 20, you may die of brain swelling. So its LD50 is 10, and it goes like that. Most drugs are in those small numbers. Cannabis has an estimated LD50 of 40,000, right? There is nothing like that. Table salt is probably down to about 50, right? So are you getting the idea? It really is in a class of its own, and that's why I feel completely relaxed in advocating a 3-tier system of supply. The Baird government and all the other right-wing half-wits that are forming governments around this country are getting their knickers in a knot over supply, or where's the drug going to come from. Because of its overwhelming safety and its complete freedom from organ toxicity, I feel that the basic starting point of a medical cannabis regime is a removal of the prohibition. Humans can sort themselves out. They don't need a nanny state which has done nothing but peddle lies and confusion on the subject since 1937 and before. Home growing, yeah, don't worry about that. Home growing has several really major advantages. Firstly, and primarily, it's a basic human right not to be told by the state what you can and can't ingest. Right? The only place the state has that right to intervene is where that impacts on other people. Things like drink driving, I'm very much in favour of breath testing, because there is a clear and unequivocal association between alcohol use and a dose response and traffic outcomes. It's clear in Colorado, after a full medical cannabis regime of only 12 months, there was a measurable decrease in fatal traffic accidents, in suicides and in domestic violence. Right? They're being very quiet about that. A measurable decrease in all of those things. So they can't use the idea of traffic safety to justify their saliva test when they're not actually testing for benzos or any of the other sedating allopathic drugs. It is a worry. Proxy growing, large and small scale, this is our second tier, where people like us, like the nimbin people, like everyone who's been involved for the last few years, can take on a number of patients. They might have a particular interest in epilepsy or in MS or in cancer treatment or whatever particular field that they're interested in, and then they can recruit a number of patients that they'll be looking after. So I might take on 1,000 epileptic children, and therefore if each of them need £3 a year, I'll have a licence to grow 3,000 pounds of cannabis, and we just keep records on that. At that scale of growing, you can afford to have an HPLC machine and do things in a proper scientific way. Now, the third tier, and only the third tier, is pharmaceutical production. Everyone's familiar with GW Pharmaceuticals. They're a group in England that actually got started back in the 90s with the help of Prince Charles, who was actually approached by the MS Society members at some stage, and he actually pushed it through for them, so good on Prince Charles. But pharmaceutical production and prescription by doctors should only be one of the three possible methods. I am very much, and it's not only a question of sour grapes, but I'm very much opposed to a profession that spent 70 years opposing the medical use of cannabis, now having the only right to prescribe it. It's simply not right. Yeah. Okay. All right. Medical cannabis is only a small part of the cannabis story. We talk about revolution now. We talk about a hemp revolution. We talk about a transition from a hydrocarbon economy to a carbohydrate economy. These things are achievable. We're talking about not achieving our Kyoto protocol targets, but exceeding them by multiples. This is possible, and unlike what the doomsayers, it won't involve a reduction in living standards. In fact, the widespread application of industrial hemp for the production of paper, for the production of hemp plastics, production of building materials, these things can be an economic engine to develop the country, a massive amount of import substitution, and a huge potential for quality job growth and export. We can do that. Okay, next. Now, listen, what do you think of a country? When you do that to its old growth forest, that appears as a positive on the country's balance of payments. So if you chop, the economists that are running this world are morons, if not psychopaths. They say you go and chop down your old growth forest and then you put it in your ledger as something that's good. You've generated $200 million worth of timber exports to Japan, but you've also degraded your country, its life and its waters. So we're dealing with hoodoo economics, and they're not leading us to a brighter future. Okay, building materials. Hempcrete is an ideal building material. We've done our first little project here just to test the material. It is fantastic. It's like working in adult plasticine. Once you've decided to build something with hempcrete, any shape you want to do, any form of building you can do, it's brilliant. Right? We're not even at the beginning of our learning curve with that, and we can do so many good things at once. See, people come to us for medicine, but then we're trying to intervene in a person's lifestyle on factors that we don't have much control over. So you give them some cannabis, but you send them back to their new house in their new car, outgassing all these volatile organic compounds, and then the house is just full of electromagnetic smog and things like that. There's only so much intervention you can do to have an effect without doing everything. And it really is a major step for people fighting cancer. They think they can take a bit of cannabis or make a few minor changes to their diet, to be successful in treating metastatic cancer involves almost a total mind-body application. Some people have done it, and hopefully as we develop the methodology, we'll become more successful than what we are. Okay, mate, next. Is everyone aware of the hemp car made by Henry Ford in 1941? Yeah, it was featured in their documentary $1 Billion Crop back in the 90s. There's Henry Ford smashing at this plastic car made in 1941. Why was that documentary buried? Not only was it buried, the American government took its index card out of the Library of Congress. We went over there in 1994. We were aware of it from Jack Herrera's email, and we went looking for it. So we were there with our film crew, and you could go through the cards. Now, let's say it was number 7. You go through 5, 6, 8. Where's number 7? We went to the librarian and said, where's number 7? He knew what we were there for. We had the cameras, we had the I Love Pot t-shirts and things like that. But he had no explanation, right? At one stage, the explanation was, oh, it had confused the kids. They might think pot is better than what it is. All right? Well, we better confuse our children, I think, if that's the case. All right, well, that's all I've got to say on the subject for now. And who wants the organisers, whether we have questions now or later?
We could do a couple of questions, I reckon.
Okay.
And then we're going to do a Q&A at the end. We're going to have a break after this one. And we'll have a break.
Okay.
So a couple of questions, although I think we'll have a break after this. But Andrew will hang around outside if you've got a really personal issue.
Hello.
Sure he'll be around to talk to.
And also
Stand up and
today's
speak up, I reckon.
Share the article, Michael. Today's Australian is Dr Katelaris.
Thank you so much. I'm really grateful for that talk, Dr Katelaris. I just have one question about one of the slides that you were going to come back to in the treatment of cancer, and you were talking specifically about the nutritional deficiencies and how omega-3, zinc, magnesium, and there was maybe one other one, those specific minerals and nutrients deficiencies in our kind of corporate diet that's out there, how those deficiencies relate to the endocannabinoid system and the treatment of cancer.
All right. That's a big question and a good question, and I can't give a definitive answer. The one where it's clear that I already highlighted, without having the right lipids going into your diet in the form of hemp seed and flax and chia and things like that, your cell membranes simply don't form in the right way that can be then used to produce the endocannabinoids, right? But there's much more to it. And in the body, it's a case of, you know, no man's an island complete in itself. We're all part of the whole. I'll just divert a little bit. I mentioned selenium, for instance. Now, selenium, because this touches on supplements too, so I'm taking a bit of liberty with that question to bring up another point. There was an experiment. Selenium is a critical trace microelement that's used to make an enzyme called glutathione reductase. Glutathione is a major antioxidant in the body, the intrinsic antioxidant. So antioxidants can occur in the body or in the diet, and you need them both. Without selenium, you don't make glutathione, you don't have the intracellular antioxidants, and you're much more prone to cancer and other diseases. Now, they did an experiment in New Zealand last year where they took, I think, 20 to 50 people, and they put them on selenium tablets, which are an expensive way to take selenium. They put the others on 2 Brazil nuts a day. Now, Brazil nuts concentrate selenium. And at the end of 3 months, they measured the blood levels of selenium, and they found that in the tablet group and the Brazil nut group, the levels were more or less the same. But when they measured the amount of glutathione in the 2 groups, they found that the Brazil nut group had 3 times as much glutathione activity. Right? So nutrition is incredibly complicated. It's not only the primary nutrient that you're after the minor cofactors as well. So I don't delude myself into thinking we have such a good grasp of human physiology that we understand the subtleties of how things work, and you can't improve on nature. Right? An elemental diet made up in a chemist's laboratory can't be as good as fruit and vegetables. You might say, why not? But it's not. There are dozens of minor elements that interact together like an orchestra, right? So the function of the endocannabinoid system really depends on the functioning of all the systems. But the one key nutrient is the lipid intake and the imbalance of 3 and 6 and the over-intake of saturated fats.
Earlier you alluded to an amount for a cancer response. You alluded to an amount of cannabis or an amount of CBDs or an amount to get a cancer response. Like, what is that amount? That seems to be a magical number.
Yeah, no, the amount's not known. Look, there seems to be two very different ways of using cannabis in cancer. Right? Now, the usual one, the prior way, the Rick Simpson sort of thing, just load them up and they'll be okay. Right? We've had a lot of trouble with Rick Simpson oil, I have to say, right? There's a lot of intolerance, a lot of inability to actually tolerate it. And the people have said to me, look, even if I die, it's better than going through that sort of thing again. That's not everyone's view, but there is a fair amount of intolerance. Now, what I'm increasingly doing now, because our primary intervention against cancer is dietary, and I'm increasingly using cannabis in a dose that's dictated by the patient's well-being. So I say, how much should I take? And I say, take the amount that best enhances your life. So we're using it as an indirect effect via the psychoimmunological connection between being happy and having a vibrant immune system. Now, having said that, in the test tube, there does appear to be a fair bit of evidence that there's a dose response. So say you've got cancer cells in there, you put in 5 micrograms, no response, 10, no response, 15, good response, 20, better response. There is a dose response, right? But whether we can translate the dose response in the test tube into the human body is another matter, right? What I've found, say for instance, we're constantly confronted by people with ovarian cancer. Now, ovarian cancer is a very lethal form of cancer because it presents late, and they end up with metastases in the stomach or in the abdomen, which interferes with their digestion of food. So with those people, we're experimenting with the idea of actually introducing the cannabis by injection in a similar way. See, it's working so well for the BCCs because you get a very high local dose. Right? Very high local dose, and it's simply not possible to eat enough cannabis to get the sort of doses we're getting on the skin, right? I don't know my way around that, and it may be that it's just not a practical strategy, but we are preparing ourselves scientifically now for looking at injecting cannabinoids strategically in places to give very high local levels, okay, but it's still very early days on that. Does that answer your question?
We're having a break next.
On the flip side of that, is there a saturation point where you're just taking too much moisture?
There's certain, well, I don't know about a saturation point, but I've seen people who, as their disease is getting out of control, they take the dose right up, and it does become negative. You can have too much oil. There's no doubt about that. And I think at the higher levels, it can even become immune suppressant. Right? And also lying around for 18 or 20 hours a day at a time is not conducive to regaining good health. Yeah. Right? So, yeah, I'm struggling with sorting that out at the moment, but at the moment, we're actually moving more towards using patient-directed dosages where they're operating on their well-being as the end point rather than some idea of 1 gram a day as per the Simpson method. Yeah. Not an easy question to answer.
Thank you, Doctor.
This is a Good Weekend magazine. This weekend, Dr. Pop. Have you seen that?
No, I haven't. I'll take it home to my mum.
So it's so nice to hear a doctor say, look, I'm not sure about that. We're still working that out. You never hear doctors say that. I love hearing that. So I reckon we should have a break. And then Chris Harris, a local healer, alchemist, is going to talk. Simo's made terrific and Narelle hemp seed food out there. And I think Andrew will hang around and you'll get a chance to talk to him out there. When the talks come back on, say in 15 minutes, we'll close that door though. So if you're outside, try and keep the noise down a bit. Make a donation out the front for Gail, the cost of everything. And really appreciate you all coming. Isn't he a hero?
adaptogens should, as part of their work, also demonstrate the normalising effect of the body's general metabolic systems, including the neuroendocrine system, which is the brain and the functional organ glands, and also our immune response. Now, this was coming, remember, from the 60s, which was before the endocannabinoid system had even been discovered. And I would argue that the further action of an adaptogen would be to be working through the endocannabinoid system, which, thanks to Dr. Katelaris' explanations before, we see is embedded throughout all of the body and involved in almost all metabolic processes. Most adaptogens are also antioxidant, and many of them are also hematoprotective, which means they protect the liver, are cardioprotective, protecting the heart, protect against chemo radiation poisoning, have anti-tumour and anti-inflammatory effects. And just by listening to those descriptions, it sounds a lot like the effects of cannabis. In conclusion, various active constituents found in herbal adaptogens work to stimulate neuroendocrine and immune systems via multiple metabolic pathways to regulate, normalise, and generally enhance functions. They do this using their entire complex range of compounds, what's known as an entourage effect, where it's not just one compound, one isolated working, it's actually